Welcome to Season 12 of the Prosthetics and Orthotics Podcast. This is where we connect with experts in the field, patients who use these devices, physical therapists, and the vendors who help bring it all together. Our mission remains the same, to share stories, tips, and insights that help improve patient outcomes. Tune in and join the conversation. We're glad you're here and hope it's the highlight of your day.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joris Peels, and welcome to another episode of the Prosthetics and Orthotics Podcast with Brent Wright. How you doing, Brent?
Hey, Joris. I'm doing well. Here's a funny story for you. So, my son plays baseball. He's getting ready to go to college to play baseball at a junior college. And something actually came across my feed, and it was this team that's in Texas that is looking to do a playoff push. It's a collegiate team, independent league. And so this was on a Saturday. So we say, hey, Connor, is this something that you want to do? He's like, I don't know. I'm getting ready to go to the beach with my friends. But he's like, it's free baseball. So literally we buy a ticket for him to go to Texas, and now he's in Texas, and he starts playing tonight with them. So he flew out the very next day. We had no idea where we're sending him. We knew the airport, and we, had a promise that he was going to get picked up by the team. But he gets all his room and board covered, and they take charter buses everywhere, and he gets to play baseball. So kind of a funny thing. And I look at my wife and I'm like, are we good parents for this? I'm not sure.
If he comes back okay, I think you're all right.
Yeah, it was one of those things where the very last game is August 8th, so literally less than 10 days. So I think he'll be fine, and it's a ton of baseball in a short amount of time. So I'm excited.
Sounds
but
right.
Anyway, it's a funny thing.
So who is on our podcast today?
Well, I'm super excited to have Dr. Stephen Gard on our podcast today. He went to Northwestern University for biomedical engineering, got his PhD in biomedical engineering. He's been around the field of orthotics and prosthetics a long time. He's been not only in a research setting, but in the VA setting. And now he's a faculty at Northwestern University, which is one of the most famous and renowned universities for prosthetics and orthotics. They've been around for a long time. And so I'm really excited to hear a little bit about his journey into the field, but then also looking at it from the education side of things, because I know that's actually come up quite a few times over the last probably 2 seasons, is the state of education, the state of the student, that sort of thing. And he's seen some transitions over the years of not only technology, but also teaching requirements, educational requirements. And so hopping into that. He's also a researcher. He's published multiple publications. He is also involved in podcasting. So we can chat a little bit about that as well. So I'm really excited to kind of get into it. He's, like I said, he's been in the field for a long time. And so anytime that we get that amount of experience, and I know we'd have to cram it into a short amount of time, it definitely makes it worthwhile for our listeners.
Awesome. So, welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Joris and Brent. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to looking forward to our discussion on your podcast.
So, tell us a little bit, how'd you get involved in prosthetics, orthotics initially?
Excellent question. I kind of got involved in a roundabout way. And let me just kind of preface that with, I wish I had known more about clinical prosthetics and orthotics back when I was in high school early on. I grew up in a very small town, a very rural area. There were no prosthetists or orthotists in the town that I grew up in. But I became interested in high school in kind of the intersection between medicine and engineering. And what really grabbed my attention at the time was the artificial heart back in the mid-'80s, getting a lot of publicity in the news. And I decided at that time I really wanted to go into engineering and design, develop, and test and evaluate artificial organs. And so I ended up once I graduated high school, I went to Texas A&M University, enrolled in their bioengineering program, and which for anyone who is kind of undecided like me, if you're interested in medicine and engineering, I can't recommend highly enough to consider bioengineering or biomedical engineering as a major in college, because you get exposed to a lot of engineering concepts and a lot of kind of medical training as well. And when I say medical, I mean I had several years of physiology, for example. I had a lot of chemistry. I had courses on biomaterials, talking about the compatibility of materials with the human body and things of that nature. And so I was very, like I said, intent on designing artificial organs as an undergrad. But I had one of my professors tell me, and he had a lot of great advice, but he said, you're never going to see artificial organs routinely used in clinical practice in your lifetime. It's not going to happen. He said, the liability is just too high. And so I started rethinking my path a little bit. And at about that time, I was also applying to graduate programs, and I applied to a handful of graduate programs across the country. I ended up coming to Northwestern University for my master's degree. And as Brent already indicated, I was enrolled in biomedical engineering, and I needed to seek out an advisor at that time. And some of the most interesting work that was being conducted in the department, I felt like at that time, was in artificial limbs. And under the direction of Dudley Childress, he led the prosthetics research laboratory here at Northwestern at the time. And so I became involved in his program. And at the time, I was very interested in kind of applying principles of electrical engineering to O&P. So my master's research project was actually designing low power circuitry so that strain gauges could be used in upper limb prostheses. And it was a project that took me 9 months to a year to complete. And along the way, though, I became very interested in the research being conducted by other graduate students around me in Dr. Childress's laboratory, much of which involved the lower limb and involved gait. So once I completed my master's degree, I decided to go ahead and pursue a PhD because ultimately I knew I wanted to lead and direct research. And so for my PhD research, I actually started focusing on lower limb prosthetics and gait analysis. And ever since I got involved kind of in those areas, I've kind of stuck with it. I continue to do research in lower limb prostheses and orthoses at this point, but I'm very interested in gait biomechanics as well. And so that has kind of defined my career. But I will say too, I've always tended to focus on problems that I feel are clinically relevant to the profession of O&P, problems that users of P&O devices contend with on a day-to-day basis, problems that are identified by practitioners as being important to the field and need to be addressed, or those areas in O&P that simply aren't receiving sufficient attention in the field. And so really that's how I got into it. And like I said, in retrospect, had I known more about clinical P&O to begin with, back when I was in high school, I may have pursued a completely different career path because I'm just enamored with the work that prosthetists and orthotists do. And I can see why it's very appealing to people who choose to go into the profession and practice and get involved clinically.
If you look at the engineering aspects of O&P, we were sometimes quite surprised how so many people kind of don't seem to rely too much on engineering, or kind of shy away from the engineering portion. Maybe don't use enough of it in daily O&P work. Do you believe that as well, or is that, or am I maybe exaggerating it?
No, I think you're actually spot on. It recently, I've had to come up with, we're starting a new course here at Northwestern for some of our MPO students, and on advanced research methods. And I need to go back and brush up on some of my engineering training, some of the engineering aspects of my education, simply because I have tended to move away from it a little bit, because I feel like my studies are very clinical in nature. And I used what I learned years ago, but I've gotten away from topics such as digital signal processing and linear algebra and things like that, for which I had years and years of education, but I just never really used it once I got into the research. It seemed like kind of the research pulled me in other directions. So I would say that observation, yours, is very accurate.
And how do we do that? How do we increase, well, on the one hand, how do we make it possible for current practitioners to kind of increase their biomechanical engineering kind of knowledge, exposure, and ability? That's right.
That's a great question. And I feel like one of the ways they can do it is by getting more involved in the literature, in peer-reviewed literature, such as Journal of Prosthetics and Orthotics, for example. I'm going to throw that out there. And by engaging in or reading these articles that talk about the latest cutting-edge research and that can educate people and help bring them up to speed on some engineering aspects associated with O&P.
Okay. And how about like new students? I mean, what's the best way to teach them about these kind of more engineering type aspects? Because a lot of the education is quite practical, but this engineering part could also be in some cases, quite a bit more abstract and some kind of bit more conceptual and kind of a bit more involving math and stuff.
Absolutely. I agree with you. You'll be surprised. There's a lot of students who come into these MPO programs now with engineering backgrounds. A lot of biomedical engineers, but also mechanical, electrical, some of these other areas. And people get drawn into O&P. So I would say roughly a third come in to Northwestern with engineering background. So they have a lot of the math and everything that goes along with it. But then the courses that are being taught in the MPO programs do teach gait biomechanics. They talk about kinematics associated with gait, ground reaction forces, joint moments and powers and things like that. So we do delve into these topics a little bit, not to a real advanced level, because we do recognize not everyone comes in with strong mathematical backgrounds. But these are areas that are being taught in MPO programs here in the U.S. these days.
And then, okay, let's talk about this gait thing, for example. It's like, what makes the human walk generally so complicated? Because it just initially it could seem really simple. It's like, but we know there's a lot going on, and it's actually really very, very complicated. And just looking at, let's say, gait, for example, like, what makes that so complicated and so difficult to understand and calculate and to make the right tools for it?
That's a really good question. And I would have to initially say we don't fully understand normal human walking. There were some papers that were published back in the 50s. There was a paper in particular, a seminal paper on the 6 determinants of gait. And it seemed to suggest, or it indicated that gait was made up of these 6 motions for the purposes, or attributes, I guess you could say, for the purpose of minimizing body center of mass displacements, thereby saving energy. And people bought into these concepts. They were easy to understand. They were readily observable. But what we found is back in the 90s, people started questioning these 6 determinants of gait and actually found that they didn't have the effects that were claimed by the original authors. And so I think we kind of disrupted this simple model of walking, able-bodied walking, in our mind at the time. And then, so we started kind of looking for what are the objectives of gait. What are we trying to achieve? It's more than just putting one foot in front of the other and moving from point A to point B. There are functional aspects of gait that we are trying to accomplish. For example, we need to provide shock absorption whenever we walk. We need to provide a nice rocker or rollover shaped mechanism with the foot and the ankle. And there's other areas. We do try to minimize energy expenditure whenever we walk, not by the ways claimed by the original 6 determinants of gait argument, but in other ways that we conserve mechanical energy in order to reduce metabolic energy from step to step. So I hope I've answered your question, Yoris. Maybe I've kind of deviated a little from what you were asking, but that's what immediately came to mind.
I didn't hear anything because I was just too shocked that we don't understand how we can walk.
Well, I do have a question though for you, Dr. Gard, on some of that. So I was part of Cal State Dominguez Hills during Tim Stath's last year. Actually, I think we were the last class when he was teaching there, and then we had Ed Ayapa from the Long Beach VA, who I know had done some publishing and such. But then even over the years, you hear, okay, so you've got the 6 determinants of gait, and then you have some people saying there's rockers, and you've got other people saying levers for walking. What are some of your personal, not necessarily beliefs, but things that you know about gait that would benefit clinicians to know at a very basic level?
Sure. And let me begin by answering. I can't say enough good things about Dr. Jacqueline Perry's book on gait analysis. I've actually got both editions of her book on my shelf, and I refer to it often. She provides a lot of good fundamental information. Then she goes really in depth on various areas associated with gait analysis, with understanding gait, understanding what's going on. But in terms of my own personal beliefs, Dr. Childress and I actually published a couple of papers on simple models of gait, in which we looked at things such as vertical motion of the body whenever you walk. Where does that come from? We also investigated a couple of the 6 determinants of gait and helped demonstrate that they're not quite correct in the thinking or in terms of what they accomplish in able-bodied walking. But I really think foot-ankle rocker mechanisms are key, are crucial for fitting prosthetic and orthotic devices, to be able to duplicate that and trying to mimic, using the term biomimetic, you could say, duplicate what able-bodied people are accomplishing whenever they walk. With regard to that too, I believe that walking speed is a parameter that we really need to pay a lot of attention to, because if you can't achieve walking speeds above about 0.8 meters per second, your gait is going to tend to be very slow, very labored, very energy inefficient. But there are mechanisms that kick in at about 0.8 meters per second and faster, in which you actually can expend less energy due to the mechanical energy you're saving from step to step, due to the inverted pendulum mechanism, if you're familiar with that. Again, foot rocker mechanisms I really tend to focus on, and I pay a lot of attention to walking speed, freely selected walking speed that people are able to achieve with their devices.
When we're talking about some of the prosthetic, so you have your normal walking, and then you have these prosthetic devices. And I love that you've really looked into, or you've really specialized in the lower extremity prostheses side of things. What are you finding? And I'd love for you to just share a little bit about the transtibial, say, socket and its implications on gait deviations, and then if we can touch on some of the transfemoral stuff as well.
Absolutely. We've done a lot of work with transtibial prosthesis users going back about 20, 25 years now. In particular, I started looking at shock absorbing components for transtibial prosthesis users back in early 2000s. Specifically, we were looking at shock absorbing pylons. And shock absorbing pylons at that time had only been on the market, 5 or 8 years or so by the time looking at 2000, 2002. But what we expected to see, what I was hoping to demonstrate, was that people could walk with shock absorbing pylons and reduce impact forces under the foot during the stance phase of gait, essentially decrease peak ground reaction forces as a result. So we conducted our study and we looked at the ground reaction forces in all of our subjects walking with and without shock absorbing pylons, and we found there was absolutely no difference in peak ground reaction forces. And at the time, we really couldn't figure out why. We thought it was perhaps that prosthesis users simply weren't walking fast enough to obtain substantial benefit from these components. And so we ended up publishing our first paper, and we said, well, when people walk faster, they're probably deriving more benefit as a result by reducing impact forces under the foot, specifically in the vertical ground reaction force. And but whenever we started transitioning to transfemoral prosthesis users, doing a very similar study, looking at the effect of shock absorbing pylons, we again found no effect of these components on ground reaction force peaks. And we started digging a little deeper in that case. And in fact, we ended up making a device that would essentially, we would put people in this device, this apparatus, they would sit on it with their prosthesis outstretched, and we would drop them from an elevated position, and they would roll down this ramp and strike their foot onto a force platform. So it was an impact testing device, you could say. And as a result, we were able to characterize the effect of the shock absorbing pylons independent of walking, independent of user control. And even in that testing, we didn't find that these components had any effect on peak forces that were being generated due to this impact, which was really perplexing to us at the time. So myself and the graduate students who were involved working on this project, we continued to think about what was going on here and finally recognized we were probably in error with the model we were thinking about for fitting people with these types of components. And that is, we weren't really taking into account the interface between the residual limb and the prosthetic socket, and which is a very compliant interface. And in fact, it's been referred to, I've heard, as a pseudoarthrosis, as a pseudo joint at that interface. And so it's not stiff. And inherently, that was an assumption we were making when fitting people with shock absorbing pylons. But whenever we considered the compliance, the soft tissue effect at that interface, it suddenly started making more sense why we're not seeing changes in ground reaction forces when people walk with shock absorbing pylons. And that's because, in essence, we have two springs in series. So for any engineers out there, you'll understand exactly what I'm saying, talking about springs in series here, of two different stiffnesses. So whatever spring has the lowest stiffness is going to dominate system response. And in this case, the spring with the lowest stiffness was actually the residual limb socket interface. It was a much lower stiffness based upon some of our preliminary testing than of the shock absorbing pylons. And so it doesn't matter if you put a shock absorbing pylon in the prosthesis, you're not going to see an effect on ground reaction forces because that effect is already being dictated by the soft tissue on the residual limb. But there still may be advantages. I'm going to throw this caveat out there that people who jog or run on prostheses may still benefit from shock absorbing components. They may also still play a role when stepping off of a curb, when walking down stairs, for example. So I don't want to completely discard shock absorbing pylons because I think they still may have benefits. And you mentioned transtibial, transfemoral. I'm going to go to osseointegration. We know that is a stiff or a rigid interface in the case of people with bone-anchored prostheses. And it could be that shock-absorbing pylons would have tremendous benefit for this population, but I've yet to read any studies where people have tested individuals walking with bone-anchored prostheses with and without shock-absorbing pylons. But it's an area that needs to be looked at.
I've got about all this tracking and trying to get the right data. I mean, I know in shoes, a lot of people try to make 3D printed kind of circuits and pressure circuits, stuff like this. And they've tried to make sensors. And the idea of a lot of these shoe and sole people is like, hey, we want to get people to wear our shoe soles for a long time. And then we can eventually end up getting the best soles, right? Because we have the most data. And it seems like there's a real opportunity for kind of semi-low-cost devices that would be worn either by patients for a long time to help data gathering, like months or years even, and maybe even like a huge opportunity to get like thousands and thousands of people with lots of different walks and conditions and things to wear these things for a long time to get a lot more data to really understand this better. Could that be a good idea?
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. We need instruments that we can fit on prostheses and orthoses or fit in them so that we can gather information, gather data for people outside of the research laboratory. Whenever we conduct experiments in a motion analysis lab, I mean, those are the best of circumstances. Those are not real world activities necessarily. And what you're talking about, data loggers to collect forces, to collect pressures, to collect movements, that would be very useful. And you're right, being able to use these instruments on a large number of people, I think would tell us a lot about how people are really using their prostheses, how much mobility they actually have from day to day. It would provide a lot of information we can't get in a gait lab.
Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. And then how about how about just generally about 3D printing? Do you think this is like a detail thing? Is it a transformative technology? What's your opinion about the impact on additive manufacturing on the O&P field?
Very good question. I do have some very definite opinions on 3D printing. I think it can be very useful for creating interfaces between the body and prosthetic or orthotic technologies. In particular, prosthetic sockets for lower limb prosthesis users, I think makes a lot of sense. And I would like to see more of that done clinically, actually. And I think the technology is there that we could do that. It concerns me a little bit whenever I see people using 3D printing as simply a manufacturing tool to make components, for example. Because I know the media, in particular, the press tends to talk about how these are low-cost devices. You can print them for next to nothing. But it kind of neglects the time that goes into designing the components for once they're printed, assembling the components and things like that. Plus, I'm not sure the materials are quite there yet in terms of their strength, durability, robustness for making prosthetic components. And when I say components, I'm talking about not sockets, not AFOs, I'm talking about knees and feet and hands and things like that. But like I said, I think there is tremendous potential. I'm excited about seeing 3D printing used for creating interfaces for P&O devices.
I think this idea of the interfaces, I think, is very interesting. And, I look back through some of the old, I love looking through old patents, old catalogs. I was actually up at Century College not too long ago, and I got to look through the Bennett Wilson collection of things and go and looking through some of the old catalogs and such. And, there seems to be a move towards some flexible sockets. And, all through history, there's been you have some regions of flexibility, regions of rigidity. I just wanted to get your take on that, the adding of the flexibility, adding of the dynamics. And do you see that as a benefit?
I think it is a benefit. And in fact, I remember from many years ago, we had one of our investigators here in our research laboratory had put together a proposal to develop sockets that were selectively compliant in some areas and stiffer in other areas. And I always thought that was an intriguing idea. I've never really seen much done with it, though. But I think there would be a lot of benefit for creating devices like that. And that's something else. I mean, I feel like the field of P&O has been historically very much an art form. You get people who really develop an eye and expertise in making good quality devices, but there hasn't necessarily been a lot of scientific rationale for creating, for processes, for devices, for things like that. Much of what we do, it seems like in clinical practice, is very biomimetic. We're trying to duplicate normal anatomy and normal function. But I think we need to consider kind of alternative means and not just making or providing someone with a rigid socket, but if we can really determine, well, the socket needs to be stiffer in this region, more compliant over here for these very particular reasons, I think that could help advance the field. I really do.
And if we talk about these interface layer things, I mean, just generally, I think there's so much possible with additive in the sense of the texture and of changing kind of internal structures, encapsulated air and kind of like customized airspace kind of thing. But we don't really see that much research. We see a lot of innovators and stuff, people using it at the front line. Let's say we see a lot of people trying to develop tools around it. We don't really see a lot of academic research where a lot of the stuff is really kind of being applied to the interfaces, specifically applied to OMP, right?
You're absolutely right. We were doing some work in this area 20, 30 years ago. Some of you may recall hearing about squirt shape, in which it was an additive manufacturing method that was actually developed in our laboratory by one of our, he was a PhD student at the time, later became faculty, but he modified his CNC machine to control an extruder head and build up a prosthetic socket in a spiral fashion, layer by layer, and it really got some interesting work, got a lot of traction in 3D printing at the time. There were some patent issues we had to overcome. There were some prototypes created that were actually sent out into the field. We were working very closely with a prosthetics facility down in the southeast region of the U.S. who continues to use this method for fabricating prosthetic sockets. This was also the time whenever CAD-CAM was very popular in the field. A lot of people were buying into it. And from what I understand, some of the companies started going out of business. People became suspect about CAD-CAM. They didn't trust it anymore. People started shying away from it, essentially. And I'm hoping that, I'm wondering if the profession is a little more cautious about kind of buying into 3D printing in spite of all the advantages that it appears to offer.
Yeah, I think people are interested in using it in daily practice and stuff, and people are using it in places where no other part of work or no other cost structure will really work. But the weirdest thing is, like, in the interface thing, I'm like, well, this is where you need to do this, because if you could just make it a little bit, wicking of heat a little bit better, if you could just make it a little bit better shock absorber, because we can make a liner that's more of a shock absorber and that wicks sweat and heat better,
Absolutely.
I can 100% guarantee you that we can do that without it quite easy. Well, not quite easily. Perfecting is difficult. It's like making a cookie, right? In the beginning, it's really easy, but to make it really good is really difficult. But I can guarantee you can get a really good result with that. But I'm just seeing like comparatively little work going on where the rubber meets the road, if you will.
I know that there are private companies working in these areas. I'm aware of a handful, but I think you're absolutely right, Joris. I can't really think of any universities currently working in this area.
And then how about like this whole idea of shock absorption and stuff? Because comparatively, there's lots of shock absorption technologies. You could do a lot of like hydraulic kind of solutions. You could do a lot of stuff, right? And you don't really see, is there like kind of new frontier out there? Because we know, like, for example, with metal additive, we can make really very, very compact actuators and very compact high-end hydraulics. And they're still really expensive, by the way, but we're talking a couple of grand or something. And we're seeing a lot of like innovation on the electrical front, right? Sensors, all these robot arm kind of things. But we're not seeing anybody spend like a couple of grand on making the ultimate shock absorber for some of these prosthetics. And especially like, the below the knee stuff, it would seem to be that it could be really advantageous there to have like very well calibrated, very well functioning shock absorption.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I suspect there are developments in improved shock absorbing components that are occurring, and people maybe are not recognizing it. And I'm thinking in particular of microprocessor controlled foot ankle mechanisms. That some of these incorporate some of the hydraulic mechanisms that you mentioned. But people are they're pursuing this line of work for other reasons besides shock absorption, but yet I believe they provide enhanced shock absorption at the same time. So it would be interesting to do a study to see if some of these microprocessor controlled foot ankle mechanisms don't provide improved shock absorption over mechanical devices.
Yeah, that could be really cool. And I think at the same time, I don't know, it's really strange that the really improved mechanical devices could really improve this experience so much, and the people aren't really looking at it. So how about like this education of OMP or education in OMP? Are things going well? Is everything perfect there, or do we need to radically change it? What's your opinion there?
I think things are going really well since everyone in the U.S. has transitioned to a master's degree in P&O at this point. I think we all tend to have very similar curricula. We're teaching very similar courses. Like I said, I believe all students are getting biomechanics now. I believe they're getting research methodology courses. In addition to the emphasis, of course, on the clinical aspects of O&P, which they should be getting in these MPO programs. Now, I will mention Northwestern recently went to a master's in prosthetics orthotics research degree, very distinct from our regular MPO degree program. We just launched this last year. We currently have our first cohort of students engaged in the MPOR program. And the idea here is we're going to be giving them more intense training in research. The program is a little bit longer, by about 6 months, in which students will be engaged in an independent research project and ultimately produce a thesis and probably several research publications as a result. So we are creating this specialized degree program for the handful of students who come through every year who have been asking us, I'd like to get more research experience. Do you all offer anything like that? Well, now we do. And I suspect other MPO programs may follow as a result. We'll see what happens there.
And do you think, and do you think that that the education thing like has to be? Do we need to update it with new things like new design tools, things about like additive, more things like FEA tools and stuff like that? Is that lacking in today's educational system?
That's a really good question, and yes, I suspect doing FEA, more 3D printing, things of that nature is simply exposing students to more of what they're going to be seeing potentially in the future. So I can see the advantages of doing that. From what I understand, though, most of the O&P educational programs, they pretty much align themselves to KHEP standards, what INCO wants to see taught, essentially preparing the students for their accreditation exams is where the emphasis is very much placed. But at the same time, I think we need to kind of push the boundaries a little bit more by exposing them to areas we think are going to become more prominent in the future.
And how about the landscape for OMP or the market? We notice a lot of things are changing. Companies are getting bought. You seem to be now having these big corporations that kind of have, they make devices, they make the parts for the devices, they do the fabrication, they do the retail. They seem to be very integrated type of firms. Embla and all these guys. Is that landscape going to mean that we need to be educating like a different type of person or preparing them for a different type of world out there?
That's an excellent question. And I've kind of wondered, I've spoken with some practitioners about these manufacturers, these companies buying out clinics and setting up essentially their own operations. I think we're all kind of sitting back and kind of watching to see what develops here. I don't know if the education is going to change as a result. Maybe it should. We'll have to just wait and see kind of what happens, I think, for the moment.
Okay. And across your time, like in working on this OMP, mechanical engineering, biomechanics, like what have been some of the biggest changes? What have been some of the things that maybe have changed the most since you joined the field and like kind of right about now?
That's a good question. And I'm going to date myself a little bit with my answer. So one of the early developments when I came on faculty here at Northwestern University was microprocessor control knees. At the time, that was new and novel. What was it? I think for example, the C-leg came to the U.S. in 97, 98, something like that. And again, that was about the time I was through with my education, entering the field as a researcher. And I thought that microprocessor control knees were just kind of a fad. I didn't think it would catch on the way that it has. However, now I see there is tremendous benefit to these types of components. And now we're seeing more microprocessor controlled financial mechanisms. And in fact, we've been having some conversations with manufacturers about potentially doing some studies in that area. Just to determine what are the benefits provided by these types of devices. So more and more, I think we're going to see more computers being incorporated into lower limb prostheses in particular, and more active control, more use of EMG for powering joints, for actuating joints, much like the upper limb. And again, we're not actively engaged in that type of research at the moment, but I think it's in the back of our mind. We're kind of watching the field, see what develops, and we may end up moving in that direction.
So I did have some questions for you. I know Northwestern has done a lot of, when we talk about like the transfemoral side of design, they've done a lot of studying into that. What is your take, looking at all of the history of the importance of socket design for transtibial, and specifically, there's always the discussion ischial containment, subischial, suction, vacuum, lanyard, and then even alignment. I know even so like Willowwood in the early 2000s, they suggested some alternative alignments that they actually had pretty good results with, but it had to do with the subischial socket. So kind of curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, we're actually very interested in different socket designs. You may recall Dr. Stefania Fatone, who used to be one of the investigators here at Northwestern. She's now at University of Washington. But Dr. Fatone and Mr. Ryan Caldwell developed this subischial socket design, and they did a number of trials, randomized control trial on this device, comparing it to ischial containment socket. And it did see some distinct benefits in providing this kind of technology. Since then, we are continuing to investigate subischial sockets, comparing them to ischial containment sockets, because it was interesting. One of the anecdotal observations was some people who were fitted with a subischial socket came in and commented that their lower back pain disappeared. It went away, or it was greatly reduced, that they noticed a change. And that got us thinking that perhaps, because we know people who use transfemoral prostheses tend to develop low back pain at a higher incidence than the able-bodied population over time. And but we don't really understand or know why this happens. Why do people develop these secondary health conditions as a result of walking with a prosthesis for long periods like that? So we are actually trying to get a study funded right now. We've got a proposal submitted. We're waiting to hear back on it to see how do subischial sockets compare with ischial containment sockets on the potential development of these secondary health conditions. You also mentioned, for example, different suspension methods. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done there as well. One of my colleagues here in the laboratory, Dr. Maddie Major, has been developing a new pump for active vacuum suspension in lower limb prosthesis users. And that study is coming to a conclusion here very soon, but they're getting some very interesting results as well. So we are actively engaged in looking at issues pertaining to transfemoral prosthesis use. And I think that's going to remain. There's a lot of good work that needs to be done in this area.
So as far as like the stability of sockets between the subischial and say ischial containment, and I know there's a lot of people that will say, hey, you know, your subischial socket or your ischial containment socket really isn't containing anything. What are you seeing as far as stability in these sockets?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I can answer that, Brent, but let me give it a shot here. Basically, I think the stability is about the same between the two, based upon the data that I've seen coming out of these gait biomechanics studies. Just to state it a little more clearly, I don't think an individual in a subischial socket is less stable than someone walking with an ischial containment. If anything, I think there are distinct advantages, again, to the subischial that you don't get with an ischial containment. And one is increased range of motion at the hip joint. Another one is increased pelvic rotations, or the potential for increased pelvic rotations in a subischial socket compared to an ischial containment, because you're not constraining the pelvis in any way with the prosthesis in that case. And so those are just kind of some thoughts right off the top of my head there.
Well, and people don't like ischial containment. I mean, even when it's done well, sitting comfort and all that stuff
exactly that's right.
is an issue. So I think it's great, and I'm glad that you guys are working on some of that. I'd love for you to kind of put your time machine hat on and go back, and I'd love for you just to describe to our listeners what you've seen as far as the movement from the certification program kind of to the bachelor's. We skipped kind of straight to this master's program, and what you feel the challenges are, so positives and negatives of doing that. And I can just say from my experience with our current residents are amazing at East Point. And so I love what the education side is doing. And I do feel like we're getting a newer style clinician, which I can really appreciate too. And we're moving away from this, you have to do everything yourself, and you're working from 5 o'clock in the morning in the lab till 10 o'clock at night when you finish up your skilled nursing facilities visits, to something more sustainable and more attractive to these younger clinicians. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Sure. And I was involved with the certificate program that we used to have at Northwestern, where essentially students would come for a 5-month period, and they would have to select either P or O to go through the program to get their education, but most would come back for the other discipline eventually anyway. So we were talking at the time a total of a 10-month program. And at the time, I mean, of course, with that limited time, you weren't able to go as deep in classroom instruction for people training to be prosthetists and orthotists at that time. They spent most of their time in laboratory activities, as they still do in the MPO program. But I was fortunate to have been involved in some of the early discussions on the field transitioning to a master's degree back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And at the time, I was somewhat hesitant to see the field move in that direction. I didn't appreciate the need for a more in-depth educational experience, for a greater diversity of education, for the inclusion of this additional material to really build a more informed, more articulate, more respected practitioner. And I even had a side conversation at one of these meetings that I attended on transitioning to the master's degree. Had a side conversation with a practitioner who impressed upon me the need to elevate the education credentials, essentially to enable prosthetists and orthotists to be more respected by their peers, by their colleagues, by physicians, by therapists, by others they interact with on this educational team. And then I was pleasantly surprised to see the Georgia Tech program, really thrive there for a while with their master's program after they transitioned. And Northwestern was actually the last school to transition to the master's program in 2015, I believe, is whenever we graduated our first class. But it was because the certificate program was just so popular right up until the very last minute. People wanting to get in and do this shorter duration program. And I can understand, because the MPO program is really, it's a big commitment for students to make. But I think as a result, they really take it seriously. I mean, I can remember back, 25 years ago, that the mentality of some of the students, not all of them by any means, but some of the students, they would look at this time in Chicago as kind of an extended vacation. They really wouldn't take the education part serious enough. And it was actually in the education program that we introduced the research methods and the biomechanics course. And in fact, I taught the biomechanics course for a couple of years there at the very beginning. And where we were exposing students to more mathematical concepts and things like that. And I had somebody come to my office one time really upset at the math we were teaching because, as he indicated to me, he said, I'm here to learn how to be a clinician. I'm not here to learn to be a biomechanist. And so I think as we've elevated the education credential, we've gone to this master's program, students know more is going to be expected of them, that they're going to have to learn more. They're going to be expected to associate biomechanics with clinical practice. They're going to have to be adept at research methodology, at the very least, for seeking out research articles and critically evaluating that information and determining, is good information being presented or is there a bias to it? In looking back, I think it was a very good decision, an excellent decision to go to this master's program. And I know there's already discussion, there's already speculation that eventually we're probably going to go to something like a doctorate in prosthetics and orthotics. And so I think, we'll give it another 10 years, but don't be surprised if there's going to be DPO programs out there.
All right, Steve. I think we can talk for hours and hours and hours on this, but thank you so much for your time. Maybe we can have you on again someday, and thank you so much for your time and your wisdom.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
And Brent, thanks for being here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gard, for coming on. This was really great, and I think there could be a part 2 because we could go on and on and on, but I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. And I just thank you for advocating for our field, advocating for great education, solid clinical education as well. And also, going against some of the normal conventions that have been, taught throughout history and really focusing on, is this a good outcome, and are we getting the data that we need to? I think that combination is really going to push our generation of clinicians to the next level.
All right. Thank you for that, Brent. And thank you for listening to another episode of the Prosthetics and Orthotics podcast. Have a great day.